Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to take a minute while we wait for folks to arrive. If you are looking for the Federal Stimulus Overview Upcoming Aid for Businesses webinar, you are in the right place. My name is Amanda Gerke. I'm with the City of Alameda's Community Development Department. And while we wait for folks to arrive, I'm just going to go over a few technical notes. So first of all, we're going to have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. So you can submit your questions through the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen. We'll also take questions throughout the presentation if they're topical to a specific slide. We've got all of our attendees on mute so that the speaker can be heard, but if you have technical questions about participating in the webinar, you can always communicate with staff, mostly me, via the chat function, but we won't be taking questions through the chat function. We are going to be recording this presentation and posting it on our website. I'm also going to send a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this webinar with the recording, as well as any resources that came up on today's call. And this webinar is being brought to you by a partnership between the City of Alameda and the Alameda Chamber of Commerce. So I'd like to take a minute to acknowledge and thank and introduce Madeline Sadek, the President and CEO of the Alameda Chamber of Commerce. And with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter today. So Vartan Djihanian is the Manager of Western Regional Congressional and Public Affairs for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. In this role, Vartan develops pro-business legislative and political activities in 5 Western states, and he assists the Chamber in strengthening its relationships with members of Congress and with state and local chambers of commerce like ours. So Vartan is going to start us off with a summary of the federal stimulus bill, which was recently passed, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A after Vartan presents, so please put your questions in the Q&A function. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Vartan.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thanks for all the wonderful work you do at the city for helping small businesses, especially over the last few months and really 9 months now, as folks have been dealing with the pandemic. And I really want to thank Madeline as well at the Alameda Chamber for just being such a phenomenal partner for the U.S. Chamber. She is very active with us. She's always the first to keep me abreast of what's going on in Alameda. She's deeply concerned about the small businesses there, and it's wonderful to work with her. So thank you so much, Madeline, for all of your partnership and cooperation. And really, most of all, I want to thank the small businesses which are on this call right now. You all have been through a lot since March as the economy has shut down. Each and every small business on this call is a vital part of your community. You're part of the fabric and the character of Alameda, and you contribute so much to the quality of life of all the residents there. So thank you for all you do. I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation with you this morning to go over the latest pandemic support. And before I really dive into the presentation, I'll backtrack and talk a little about, how we got here. Back in March of last year, Congress approved the CARES Act, which was a $2 trillion piece of legislation, which, among other things, provided forgivable loans for small businesses which have been adversely affected by the pandemic. Those loans were known as the PPP loans. We had some hiccups with it when it was originally released, but eventually, as the year went on, I think that most businesses who were eligible for it ended up receiving a PPP loan. Now that in many situations, people have expended all of that money and now they're ready to re-up that money. So Congress recently approved an additional stimulus effort, which I'll go into today. This took quite a long time and a lot of effort. They've been really trying to do this since like May, June, but you know how politics works, especially in a very heated election cycle. So it took a little longer. So I'm happy to go over that legislation. So this graph that we're looking at right now kind of goes over where the economy was prior to COVID-19. As you can see, a lot of the different industries were fairly even in how they were doing. Technology, retail, software services was doing just as well as travel, entertainment, hospitality, and food services. But as soon as the recession hit as a result of the shutdowns, everybody kind of nosedived. But as the economy slowly started to open up and some of the industries started doing better, that's when you start to see that divide, where you see technology, retail, and software have slowly done better and better as time has gone on. Other industries like travel, entertainment, hospitality, food services have really struggled. And my heart really goes out to those industries because I know so much of that is tied to how our state and local government has reacted to the virus. And I know, like, for example, I live in LA County. There's just been so many fits and starts. Like, one minute they tell you the restaurants you can open up as provided you provide outdoor furniture and a patio. And then the next thing you know, they take that away from you. All the businesses that had invested in buying the table and chairs and the outdoor coverings, now they're all out of that money. And not only that, they're shut down and they can't serve folks. So I know that there's been a will for these businesses to get back and to open up, but unfortunately, the combination of the virus peaking and the reaction from the state and local government has really hurt the businesses. And that's kind of what you see on this graph. So just to kind of go over how various industries were affected and how they've lost employment numbers over the years. You can see motion picture and sound recording, that's really almost down 45%, accommodation down 31%, travel down 32%. And then as you go down the list, the industries get a little better. Transportation's down almost 24%, museums, historical sites down 22%, apparel is down 17%. As the economy is slowing down, nobody really needs to continue to buy new clothes or replenish their clothes. So you see that throughout. And sometimes it's also on a business by business basis. Sometimes I speak to like retailers who have been able to successfully manage to pivot all their business to online, and they've done okay. And other businesses who didn't have a strong retail or online presence before the pandemic weren't able to scale up as quickly. So those folks those folks benefited from having that strong online presence before. Sometimes, there's no rhyme or reason to why some industries do better and some don't, even within the same sector. So what happened at the end of December, at the very end, of course, Congress finally passed this latest stimulus package. It's a $900 billion piece of legislation compared to the CARES Act, which, as I said, is $2 trillion. It's 5,600 pages long. I used to work in the House of Representatives in Washington. These bills are impossible to read. I mean, can you imagine? You get 6,000 pages and you're going to go vote on it in a couple of hours. And so really these members of Congress, they just vote on the summaries. So I'll go over some of the top line issues that were included in the bill. First, there was some support for individuals. So let's put businesses aside for a second. Those folks who are unemployment, originally under the CARES Act, they received a $600 bonus per week. Under this new piece of legislation, for up to 11 weeks, you would get a $300 bonus on top of what you're getting from the state unemployment office. In addition to that, we'll be receiving stimulus checks like under the first initial CARES Act. And so the same rules apply for the stimulus checks. It would be, so if you earn $75,000 or less as an individual, you would get a check for $600. And if you earned $150,000 or less as a joint filing couple, you'd get $1,200. And then dependents also get benefits from that. On the small business front, there was $284 billion designated for the Paycheck Protection Program. $15 billion for, these are for grants for live venues, and I'll talk about that as well. And then $10 billion in grants for the economic injury disaster loans, and we'll get into that as well. In addition, I'm not going to go too far in depth on these items, but in addition to what I mentioned is included for individuals and for small businesses, there's also housing support in there, which includes extending the eviction moratorium until the end of January. And then there's $25 billion for rental assistance. Additionally, there's money, they start adding some COVID relief funding in here as well. So there's money for vaccines, vaccine distribution, money for healthcare providers, as well as for SNAP and child benefits. And then you see $45 billion for transportation. That's kind of like what I said, what happens when you have a 6,000-page bill, they start adding all kinds of things in there. So the Paycheck Protection Program is one of the items included in here. It reopens the program and extends it through January 31st, 2021. The really good news about this that I'm excited about is that it now includes 501c6 nonprofits, and for the most part, that means local chambers of commerce. And chambers of commerce have been on the front lines, fighting for the small businesses, helping them navigate these loan programs. A lot of them have been struggling themselves, but they've still been working in the office from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., just helping their local small businesses. And so finally, they're able to participate in the Paycheck Protection Program, although they haven't been in the past. So when I mentioned Madeline worked so hard, we're constantly in touch, and she's always filling me in on what she's doing out there. But finally, I'm hoping that chambers like Madeline will, at the Alameda Chamber, if they need to, they can also participate in this new round of the Paycheck Protection Program. There's also a second draw for the really hard hit businesses. So for some of those industries that I described that are having a harder time climbing back, those folks would have an opportunity to go in for a second draw. And I'll go through some of the criteria that's required to be able to apply for it. There's also a simplified forgiveness for small loans. As I mentioned, the Paycheck Protection Program offers forgivable loans. So after you exhaust the loan, you have to go back to your lender and fill out an application for forgiveness. And as part of that, they said if you earn a certain amount of money, you only have to fill out a 2-page forgiveness document instead of the longer ones that if you apply for a multi-million-dollar loan. It also expands the list of eligible expenses for forgiveness. So if you remember back in the original Paycheck Protection Program, they had a breakdown where they said, okay, 60% needs to be used for payroll, but you also have the opportunity to use 40% for additional expenses. And those expenses were items like rent or mortgage interest, utilities, that type of thing. But now they're saying you also can be forgiven if you use the money for PPE, for protective equipment for your employees or for your establishment, or if you had to purchase supplies like the sneeze guards or the dividers, or like a drive-through, glass for your drive-through windows, that type of thing. You can also write that off. Also, if your goods include perishable goods, like if perishable goods are essential for your business, like food, if you're a restaurant, you're also able to write that off for forgiveness as well. So that's some really good news as part of this Paycheck Protection Program, the new revised one. And by the way, that list of eligible expenses now that would be forgiven, you can also apply that if you got the original PPP loan. So it doesn't just have to apply if you get a second draw. Also, the new guidelines say that it would overturn IRS guidance regarding forgiveness and deductibility of expenses, which is also good news. That's saying essentially that your new loan, you wouldn't be taxed on the Paycheck Protection Program loan that you would get as if it were normal revenue. It would be tax-free. And also for deductibility, if you use the loan for expenses, you would still be able to deduct the amount that you use for expenses, like your like as if it was your normal revenue coming in. So not only will you not get taxed on the forgiveness, but you can deduct your expenses that were used with that loan. And then there's EIDL grant. For a lot of folks, they applied for these economic injury disaster loans, which offered up to a $10,000 grant for your small business. But what they said was, if you get the EIDL grant and you also get a PPP loan, whatever money you get in the EIDL grant would be reduced from your forgiveness for the PPP money. So let's say, for example, if you got a $10,000 EIDL grant and you got a $100,000 PPP loan, when you sought forgiveness for the PPP loan, you're only able to get forgiveness for $90,000 and not the full amount, because you had already gotten the EIDL grant money. But now they're saying you can both get the EIDL loan and the PPP, and both would be considered grants. And for the EIDL, it would be up to only $10,000. Although you're able to get a EIDL loan for above the $10,000, you would only get a grant for $10,000. And then here's something else that's another exciting program for small businesses, is this new employee retention tax credit. Now, this was also offered last time under the CARES Act, and it was for a tax credit of up to $5,000 per employee. But what they said at the time was, if you got this tax credit, you also got the Paycheck Protection Program loan, you couldn't get both. So you had to pick. You're either going to get the tax credit or you're going to get the PPP loan. Now what they're saying is you can get both. And not only can you get both, but instead of the employee retention tax credit being $5,000, it'll be up to $14,000. So that's good news, and that's good for the first 6 months or 2 quarters in 2021. That would be for eligible. That would be for businesses that are up to 500 employees. It would be per quarter versus per year. So you would have had to demonstrate a 20% loss in receipts, and you would only have to do that per quarter. So you would look at 2021 and you would compare that to back to 2019 and see if you had a 20% in loss in receipts based on a similar quarter before the pandemic hit, then you would be eligible for this tax credit. And it wouldn't be for the entire year. You would just look at it a quarter at a time. And like I said, you can receive both the PPP and the employee retention tax credit. So I'll go into a little more detail here. So the employee retention tax credit, as I mentioned, it's a tax credit of up to $14,000 per employee. So that would be $7,000 per employee for each quarter, for each of the first 2 quarters of 2021. This is a refundable tax credit. So essentially, if you get, if the amount in taxes that you pay exceeds or is less than the tax credit, then you would also make up that difference. So for example, if we're going to pay $3,500 in taxes for 1 quarter, but since this tax credit is $7,000 per quarter, you would get a check for that difference between the $3,500 and the $7,000. So you get a check for $3,500 if you didn't pay the full amount in taxes. What's nice about this tax credit, not only is it a refundable credit, but it's also advanceable. So if you contact the IRS, they will advance this money to you, provided that you meet the eligible criteria that you had a 20% decline of gross receipts in the quarter compared to 2019. So in order to get this tax credit, my best advice is for you to contact whoever handles your accounting or your bookkeeping. Sometimes they do it through like a payroll company like ADP or something. They're all receiving guidance right now on how to handle this. So whoever handles that for you, for your individual case, I suggest you contact them and let them know. The other good news about this employee retention tax credit is that, like I mentioned, they also offered one last year, which was up to $5,000. A lot of people didn't go for that because they also were going to get the PPP, but now, like I said, you can get both. So, so talk to your tax accountant or your bookkeeper and see what your eligibility would be, because you might be able to get that $5,000 from last year as well. For the second draw of the PPP loan, the loan would be forgivable up to $2 million. And that's different because the original PPP program was forgivable up to $10 million. So they've reduced the amount of loan that you can get, which I think for the most of the businesses that I work with, they won't be affected by that. And because they got so much backlash, because some of these bigger businesses got the loans, they've reduced the what they would define as a small business from 500 employees down to 300 employees. So if you want to go for this particular loan this time, again, if you want to participate in it, you would have to be a business with fewer than 300 employees. And you'll also have to have exhausted your first PPP loan, and you'll have to show that you've had more than a 25% decline of gross receipts in a quarter compared to 2019. So the requirements for the second draw of PPP are a little more stringent than the first round, because for the first round, if you were going for it, you only had to make an attestation that your business was not doing as well off as 2019. So you just had to attest to that. Now they actually want to see how your revenues have decreased. So there's a little bit of a higher bar, but like I said, if you're in certain industries, then you might be able to meet that threshold. The other part of this is that if you're a business which did not ever apply for a PPP loan because it was shut off, they shut it off in September. This reopens it. So you're now able to apply for a first draw of PPP, and you would only have to meet the original criteria for the PPP loan and not this more stringent requirement. So I mentioned to you that there are also those economic injury disaster loans, and you could get a grant of up to $10,000. You can apply for a bigger loan, but up to $10,000 would be a grant. There are some changes to that. You would have to be a business that has 300 or fewer employees. You would also have to be in a census tract that's eligible for this grant. And so it's called a new market tax credit. So if you're eligible for the new market tax credit, then you would be eligible for this economic injury disaster loan. And the way you can tell is just Google new market tax credit map, and plug in your zip code, and you'll be able to see whether you're eligible for this particular grant. You would have to show a 30% reduction in gross receipts for an 8-week period between March 2nd, 2020 and December 31st, 2020, compared to a similar period from 2019. So in addition to those economic injury disaster loans, I don't know if anyone from a live venue is on here, like some kind of theater or movie theater, or someone who's a talent producer is on here. But there are live venue grants now available. It's a grant of up to $10 million or 45% of 2019 gross earned revenue, whichever is less. So the point here is, though, if you're a live venue grant, you can't apply for both the PPP and this live venue grant, which is fine. You just have to go through and see which fits your situation better. This live venue grant for some folks is preferable because you can get up to $10 million when the PPP is only up to $2 million. And this grant is treated as a grant. It's not treated as a forgivable loan, so you don't have to deal with some of those loan forgiveness issues that folks who get a PPP loan have to deal with. So you would have to have a 25% reduction in gross earned income. And like I said, if you're a live venue operator or promoter, theatrical producer, live performing arts organization, museum operator, motion picture theater operator, or talent representative, this is what you should be looking at. So as I said, There was a lot of back and forth when they were deciding how they were going to finally pass this legislation. Washington is just basically a sausage-making factory. You don't want to see what goes on in the process. So both the Republicans and the Democrats had these red lines. They said, we're absolutely, whatever I vote for has to include, the Republicans said, I want a liability shield for businesses and schools. What that means is that if somebody was going to sue your business because they claim that they got coronavirus, they contracted it at your place of business, or an employee wants to sue you for that, Republicans were saying there should be some kind of liability protection for folks, for employers who have taken all the health precautions and followed all the local, state, federal guidelines. They should not be able to be sued. The trial lawyers really pushed back against that. So finally, the Senate Majority Leader said, okay, we're going to take that off the table, provided that that the Democrats take off the state and local aid off the table. And that's how they made a deal. Both had these firm lines that they weren't going to cross, and each had to give something up. And that's how they came up with the final bill. So neither of these items was included in the final bill. Now, if you received the PPP loan last time and you're looking at how you're going to be forgiven for that, the U.S. Chamber has some really good guides on this. You can find them at uschamber.com/coronavirus. And I will say, I do so many of these different presentations and I watch a lot of these presentations. The U.S. Chamber guidelines are absolutely terrific on this stuff. So whether it's for the loan forgiveness guide or the PPP checklist or some of these other items on here, I really urge you to go to this website, uschamber.com/coronavirus, and it's a step-by-step process in how you can get forgiveness or look at some of these different programs. So that's my presentation, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them for you.
Thank you, Vartan. So we have had a few questions come in, and folks who have additional questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A function. So one question that came in through the chat was about locating the Cdfis that are accepting PPP loans. I know that's a very specific question, but it's one I've heard from other folks as well. Do you know of any resources for identifying those institutions?
You know, I don't have them off the top of my head. Really, you have to be aggressive with this and contact credit unions, local banks. I suggest that first start with your own bank or credit union, and then from there start with the smaller banks and with the smaller credit unions, because they're being given priority. Last time there was a lot of backlash because the media always exposes the big business that got a loan, or people who are powerful. They call their banker and they get a loan immediately. So they're being very sensitive to that right now, and they want to make sure that it's available. So you have to take the initiative to contact your local banks, contact your bank, and then start contacting the smaller community banks and smaller credit unions, because they're the ones who are gonna start with these loans first.
Thank you. Okay. So another question is, I have my first PPP with Bank of America. I have not saved my loan documents, and I do not have the bank and SBA loan numbers to use for my PPP forgiveness application. How can I find them?
I'd call the lender.
Okay. And just so folks know, we are going to be doing another webinar on Tuesday, this upcoming Tuesday, the 19th at 10 a.m. We're going to have representatives from the SBA and SBDC and East Bay SCORE, and that webinar is really going to focus on technical assistance for the PPP loan. So I'm also taking notes of these questions, and we can also, I'll ask them to address them on Tuesday as well. So I don't have a sign up link for that webinar yet, but for everyone who is signed up for this webinar, I'll include it in the follow-up email. So you guys will get a link to sign up for that.
And on that, like I mentioned, the PPP, you're going to have to pursue that through your lender. But for the idle grants and also for the live venue grants, you're going to have to go directly to the SBA on that. So if you're going to apply for either of those two grants, you should really participate in that call with SBA, because you can get the information straight from the horse's mouth on that.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is, under PPP, a borrower can spend the loan proceeds on any allowed expenses in any proportion they choose, e.g. 100% on rent, while the 60% rule regarding payroll expenses applies only to forgiveness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's that understanding.
Yeah, so if you're gonna get forgiveness on the loan, you have to follow that 60-40 split and use 60% on payroll, and then the 40% on the allowable expenses. That's the criteria for forgiveness. But if you don't get forgiveness, they would just treat that as a standard loan. You can talk to your lender about that.
Okay.
It's a low interest loan, by the way.
So we have a question here about, will a recording of the webinar be made available for reference? Yes, we are going to put this up on the city's website, and I'm also going to be sending all of the attendees a link to the recording of the webinar. So those are all the questions that we've received through the Q&A. Maybe just give folks another minute to add any questions that come to mind. I had a question actually, Vartan, for the idle grants. Are those open for application right now?
They weren't a couple of days ago, but you can just check the SBA website. Yeah.
Okay. So we've got another question here. What is the most recent update for forgiveness of PPP loans now?
So the information that I gave you, so the original items continue to be forgivable. Like I said, the rent or the mortgage expenses and utilities, but you would also be able to seek forgiveness for PPE, for those perishable goods. So if you're ready to get the forgiveness, talk to your lender about filling out that paperwork. The U.S. Chamber has that guide, but the good news is that the new items that you can get forgiven for, that's retroactive. So you would be able to use that. You would be able to get forgiven for that amount, even though you got the first round of PPP. I believe, if that's the question that you're asking.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Vartan, for your time today and coming on. This presentation was incredibly informative. I know I learned a lot.
My pleasure. And
we've got two more questions that just popped up. So the question is the idle loan forgivable?
So up to $10,000 would be a grant. If you got more than $10,000, that would be treated as a loan, but it would be forgivable if it's up to $10,000 and you follow that criteria, which was you have to be in that census tract that's called the new market tax credit census tract, and you can do a Google search for that map to see whether your zip code is eligible for that. You would also have to meet that 30% reduction in gross receipts for an 8-week period between March 2nd, 2020 and December 31st, 2020. And your business would have to have 300 or fewer employees. If that's the case and you meet all of those guidelines, then yes, it would be a grant. So you wouldn't even have to seek forgiveness for that. That $10,000 would just be a grant.
Okay, and I'm gonna, just so folks know, I'm gonna track down that new market tax credit map and I'll include it in the email that we send out as follow-up to here. So here's a question. I received an idle loan, but not a $10,000 grant. Do I need to ask SBA to forgive $10,000 out of the loan?
I'm sorry, did you say she did not receive the full amount, the full $10,000?
So they did not receive a $10,000 grant, just an idle loan, I think, in the first round.
Does she know, does the person say how much they received? Is it less than 10,000 or more than 10,000?
They did not say. Okay,
because if it's less than 10,000, you can request to receive the full amount. So you can get up to, like, let's say, because initially what happened was they said, oh, you can get a $10,000 grant, and people applied for the $10,000 grant, but they got like $1,500 or $2,000 because the money ran out. So now, if you meet that criteria, you can get, if you got, for example, $2,000, you can get $8,000 additional dollars, which would be a grant.
So it looks like this person got a $150,000 loan, and they're wondering if they can get 10,000 of that forgiven because they didn't get a grant the first time, or do they need to reapply for a grant?
So the $10,000, if you're eligible for the original EIDL grant guidelines, then yeah, that $10,000, the first $10,000 of that $150,000 grant that they received, or the loan that they received, would be considered a grant.
Okay, thank you. So here's a question: what supports are being provided or requiring banks, credit unions to provide to minority and women-owned businesses, given the disproportionate impact on them?
So one thing that they're doing is, you know how I talked about how the first initial banks and credit unions that will receive this money are the smaller ones. That's one of the ways that they're trying to help minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses, is instead of going to these huge banks, they're going directly to the community banks so that they can get closest to the communities as possible. The other item is with this, with the EIDL grants, those are in areas that have sometimes more minority communities in them. So they're trying to offset that as well by providing those $10,000 EIDL grants.
Thank you. Okay, so for the 40% of the PPP loan, are mortgages also eligible? I rent my building to my business. Would the rent be forgivable?
The mortgage interest would be forgivable.
Okay. So here's another one. If PPP and employee tax credit can both be used at the same time, does that mean from January to March I can use both?
Yes. Yep. That's what's new and exciting about the new tax credit, is that you can use both, provided you meet the criteria.
Okay. So maybe while we just wait and see if there's any other email, I just wanted to let people know that I will be following up with an email that includes a link to a recording of this webinar, some of the resources that we discussed on the call, and then also a sign up for a PPP specific technical assistance webinar with the SBA that will be next Tuesday, January 19th at 10 a.m. So I don't see any other questions coming in just now. Yeah, I would love to, oh, here we go. Can we have the link to apply for the tax credits? I will put that in the follow-up email to everyone.
Yeah, and for the tax credits, you really should talk to your accountant or your bookkeeper, or a lot of times like ADP or something will handle your payroll. It's handled through the payroll deduction, when you pay your payroll taxes. So so whoever handles that for you should be able to help you out with that.
Just waiting one more minute because I keep thinking we're done with questions and we're not. Okay, I think that might be it. But oh, here we go. Can you tell more about liability shield to schools?
Yeah, like I said, unfortunately, that wasn't included last time. But it's something that we at the U.S. Chamber are working hard to implement. We'll see how it goes with everything going on in Congress right now. Things are all over the place. But it's really a priority for us, because the last thing our small businesses and our schools need is to have some kind of lawsuit in the middle of all this stuff, especially if they've followed all the local, state, federal guidelines. There's only so much you can do There are so many unscrupulous attorneys out there. I already see the ads here, like, did you contract COVID in the workplace, or did you attract COVID at the pizza parlor? And they want you to sue because they'll get a cut of that. So we're saying that, look, if you're flagrant about this stuff, by all means, you should be sued. But if you did everything you can and somebody still claims that they contracted it at your workplace, then you should have some protection. So that continues to be a priority for the U.S. Chamber, and we want to make sure our small businesses are protected with that. So we're going to put up a strong fight for it next year or this year.
Thank you. So here's another question. Regarding rent versus loan interest being forgivable, it depends on the borrowers, right? If the PPP borrower is a tenant, they can apply to have the rent forgiven. If the PPP borrower is the mortgage borrower, then they can claim the interest towards forgiveness, but not the payment of the principal, right?
Yes, that's how it's supposed to be. But talk to your lender about that more specifically. But in theory, that's how it works.
Okay. I don't see any more questions coming in. We got to thank you. Vartan, did you have any concluding comments?
I was just going to say that if any questions do come in later on, or if you think of something later in the day or tomorrow, both Amanda and Madeline know how to get a hold of me. Feel free to send them to them, and I will answer them to the best of my ability.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And Madeline, we really appreciate your helping to set up this webinar and make it happen. I know our business community appreciates it as well. And I will be sending an email to all of the participants and posting the link of this on our website. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Have a great day.
Bye.